abandoned by his girlfriend on Christmas Eve. 18 years later, he found her and was shocked to discover that she was now working as Santa's elf at the same mall. A Christmas Eve proposal at Burlington Square Mall turns into public humiliation when Rebecca cruelly abandons Thomas, a devoted music teacher caring for his mother with Alzheimer's. 18 years later, their paths cross again at the same mall, but everything has changed. The Last Christmas Gift is a story about betrayal, redemption, and how sometimes life's worst moments become our greatest blessings. Settle in for a touching tale that proves timing is everything, especially during Christmas. Join us as we watch love, karma, and faith weave together in this heartwarming story that has touched millions. Get cozy, grab your tissues, and discover why sometimes the best gifts are the ones we never saw coming. The snow is falling in Burlington, Vermont, and miracles are about to unfold. The soft beeping of medical equipment filled the modest living room of Thomas Wilson's small Vermont home. At 45, his life had fallen into a predictable routine. Wake up, help his mother with breakfast, prepare her medications, head to school to teach music, rush home during lunch to check on her, return to finish his classes, then spend evenings caring for her as Alzheimer's slowly took her memories away. But this Christmas Eve of 2006 felt different. For the first time in months, his mother Margaret was having one of her lucid days. She sat in her favorite armchair, smiling as she watched Thomas grade papers, her eyes clearer than they had been in weeks. "You look just like your father when you concentrate," she said, making Thomas look up with surprise at the clarity in her voice. These moments were becoming increasingly rare, and he treasured each one. "I was thinking about our Christmas shopping trips," Margaret continued, her voice steady. "Remember how we used to spend every Christmas Eve at Burlington Square Mall? You'd always stop to watch the choir by the big tree." Thomas smiled, remembering those precious moments. Long before he became a music teacher, those mall performances had sparked his love for music. After his father passed away when Thomas was just 10, those Christmas Eve visits became their special tradition. Now, 25 years later, Thomas had a different reason to visit the mall tonight. His hand unconsciously touched the velvet box in his pocket. 2 years of savings transformed into a diamond ring for Rebecca, his girlfriend of 15 years. Rebecca. The thought of her made him both nervous and excited. They'd met when he first started teaching at Burlington High School. She was already climbing the corporate ladder then, but something about the quiet music teacher caught her eye. Their relationship had survived 15 years, even as she rose to become a successful executive while he remained dedicated to his teaching and caring for his mother. Lately, though, something felt different. The missed calls, the late meetings, the subtle criticisms about his excessive devotion to his mother. But Thomas pushed these thoughts aside. Tonight would change everything. A gentle knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Mrs. Harrison, his 80-year-old neighbor, entered with her usual warm smile. She'd been checking in on them regularly since Margaret's diagnosis, becoming like a second mother to Thomas. "Just wanted to make sure you're both set for tonight," she said, setting down a container of her famous chicken soup. "The prayer group is so excited about your big moment." Thomas felt his face flush. The whole church community had rallied around him, helping with his mother's care, supporting his music program. They'd become the extended family he and Margaret needed. "The students are ready," he whispered to Mrs. Harrison while his mother dozed. "They've practiced the song perfectly." He'd spent months composing a special piece for tonight, teaching it secretly to his most talented students. They would perform it just before he proposed, their music filling the mall's central court where he and his mother had spent so many Christmas Eves. Mrs. Harrison squeezed his hand, but Thomas noticed a flicker of concern cross her face. "Have you noticed anything different about Rebecca lately?" she asked carefully. Thomas hesitated. The last few months had been strange. Rebecca seemed more distant, constantly checking her phone, working later than usual. But tonight would fix everything. Christmas Eve, the perfect proposal. Their families and friends gathered around. It would be magical. "Everything will be perfect," he said, more to himself than to Mrs. Harrison. "Mom's having a good day, the students are ready, and Rebecca..." He paused as his phone buzzed with a text from her. Running late, meeting with Charles about year-end reports. See you at the mall. Charles, her new business partner. Thomas pushed away the uneasy feeling in his stomach. Tonight wasn't about business meetings or Charles. Tonight was about love, family, and new beginnings. As the winter sun began to set, Thomas helped his mother into her warmest coat. Mrs. Harrison adjusted Margaret's scarf, whispering a quiet prayer. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and gentle, like a blessing from above. What Thomas didn't know was that this Christmas Eve would change everything, just not in the way he had planned. Thomas pulled into the school parking lot early that morning, just as he had every day for the past 15 years. The November chill hadn't stopped his students from gathering outside the music room, clutching their instruments and sheet music for the secret rehearsal. Remember, he told them, unlocking the door, not a word about this to anyone, especially not to Ms. Rebecca if you see her at the mall. Sarah Mitchell, his most dedicated student, nodded seriously. We've got this, Mr. Wilson. We'll make it perfect for your proposal. The rehearsal went smoothly until his phone rang. It was the home health aide. Your mother's having a difficult morning, Mr. Wilson. She's asking for you. Thomas quickly packed up his things. Keep practicing, everyone. I'll be back for afternoon classes. At home, he found his mother in tears, confused about where she was. It took an hour to calm her down, making him late for his first class. As he rushed back to school, Rebecca called. I can't make lunch today, she said. Charles scheduled an emergency budget meeting. That's the third time this week, Thomas replied, trying to keep the disappointment from his voice. We're closing a major deal. You know how it is. There was a pause. By the way, your mother's nurse called me when she couldn't reach you. Maybe it's time to consider a care facility? Thomas gripped the steering wheel tighter. We've talked about this. I promised Dad I'd keep her at home. That was before the Alzheimer's got worse. You're killing your career, Thomas. You could be conducting at the state level by now, instead of teaching high school chorus. The conversation ended with tension, as most of their recent talks had. At school, Mrs. Harrison's daughter Jane, the school secretary, stopped him in the hallway. Mom asked me to check on you, she said. She's worried. I'm fine, Thomas insisted, just juggling a lot with Mom and the proposal preparations. It's not that, Jane hesitated. Yesterday, Mom saw Rebecca having lunch with that new business partner of hers, Charles, at the expensive French place downtown. They seemed close. Thomas forced a laugh. They're working on a big deal. It's nothing. But that night at the church fundraiser, he couldn't ignore the way Rebecca lit up when Charles walked in. Tall, confident, dressed in an expensive suit, Charles commanded attention. Rebecca immediately went to his side, discussing business while Thomas helped his mother navigate the crowded room. Such a shame, Mrs. Peterson from his prayer group whispered to her friend. Did you hear Charles is divorced? 3 times, they say. All that money, but no family values. Thomas tried to focus on his students instead. They were making progress with his composition, even adding their own touches to make it special. The piece would be perfect for the proposal, a melody of devotion and promise. Later that evening, helping his mother get ready for bed, she had a moment of clarity. Something's wrong with Rebecca, she said, her eyes sharp and present. I may forget things, but I remember how love looks. That's not how she looks at you anymore. Mom, you're tired, Thomas said gently. Let's get you to bed. But that night, he couldn't sleep. He thought about Rebecca's changing behavior, the late meetings, the missed calls, how she'd stopped visiting his mother. He thought about Charles, about the whispers at church, about his mother's words. Then he looked at the ring box on his nightstand and pushed the doubts away. 15 years together had to mean something. The proposal would fix everything. Christmas Eve would be perfect. What he didn't know was that every ignored warning, every dismissed concern was leading him toward a moment that would shatter his world, but ultimately set him free. Sometimes, Mrs. Harrison had told him that morning, God's greatest gifts come wrapped in pain. He wouldn't understand those words until it was too late. Christmas Eve morning arrived with heavy snow. Thomas woke early to help his mother dress for their special day. To his joy, she was having another lucid moment. It's Christmas Eve, she said, smiling. We're going to the mall, aren't we? Yes, Mom, just like always. Thomas helped her with her sweater. And today is extra special. Because you're proposing to Rebecca. His mother's eyes were clear and focused. I remember. The doorbell rang. Mrs. Harrison arrived with several church ladies to help get Margaret ready. They had all insisted on being at the mall for the big moment. The students are already there, Mrs. Harrison said. Sarah's keeping them organized. Thomas checked his phone. No messages from Rebecca. He dialed her number. I'm running late, she answered. Last-minute meeting with Charles. I'll meet you there. At 4 o'clock, Thomas helped his mother into the car. The mall was packed with last-minute shoppers, but Jane had reserved spots near the entrance. Inside, the massive Christmas tree sparkled in the center court. His students were gathered by the tree, instruments ready. Sarah gave him a thumbs up. Everything was perfect. Except, "Where's Rebecca?" his mother asked. "She's coming." Thomas checked his phone again. No messages. 5 o'clock. The scheduled time arrived. The crowd grew as word spread about the special performance. Thomas's entire church community was there, along with school families and teachers. 5:30. Still no Rebecca. "Should we start?" Sarah whispered. Thomas nodded. The students took their positions. The first notes of his composition filled the air, a melody of love and promise he'd spent months perfecting. That's when he saw her. Rebecca walked through the crowd, but she wasn't alone. Charles was with her, his hand on her back. Thomas stepped forward, the ring box heavy in his pocket. But before he could speak, Rebecca held up her hand. "Stop," she said. The music screeched to a halt. "Just stop." The crowd fell silent. "I can't do this anymore," Rebecca announced, her voice loud and clear. "This pathetic small-town life, the endless care for your mother, the stupid school concerts." Thomas stood frozen. "Rebecca, what?" "Charles and I are moving to Los Angeles. We've been together for months." She laughed, a cold, harsh sound. "Did you really think I'd stay here forever? Watching you waste your life taking care of an old woman who doesn't even remember who you are most days?" Margaret's voice cut through the silence. "I remember enough to know what cruelty looks like." Rebecca turned to her. "Oh, look, a moment of clarity. Enjoy it while it lasts." "That's enough." Charles stepped forward. "Let's go, Rebecca. Our flight's waiting." Thomas finally found his voice. 15 years? Why like this? Why here? "Because you need to understand," Rebecca said. "This is what ambition looks like. This is what success looks like. Not staying stuck in a small town. Playing nurse to your mother and teaching kids for pocket change." She turned to leave, then stopped. "Oh, and that song? It's terrible. Just like everything else about this sad little life you've built." The crowd watched in shocked silence as Rebecca and Charles walked away. Thomas stood motionless, the ring box visible in his hand. Then something unexpected happened. Margaret stood up from her wheelchair. With steady steps, she walked to her son. In front of everyone, she hugged him. "My boy," she said clearly. "Sometimes God takes things away to give us something better." The students, led by Sarah, began playing again. Not Thomas's proposal song, but Silent Night. Other voices joined in, filling the mall with music. Mrs. Harrison took Thomas's other hand. The church ladies surrounded them. School families stepped forward. In that moment, surrounded by his true family, Thomas realized his mother was right. But it would take years, and a very special Christmas Eve yet to come, before he understood just how right she was. The snow fell harder outside, covering the world in white, as if trying to erase the pain of what had just happened. But some marks can't be erased. They can only be transformed. The days following Christmas Eve passed in a blur. Thomas went through the motions, helping his mother, teaching his classes, attending church. But inside, he felt hollow. The story spread quickly through Burlington. People talked in whispers when he passed. Some tried to set him up with their daughters or nieces. Others just patted his arm and said, "God has a plan." A week after the incident, Sarah Mitchell stayed after choir practice. She stood at the piano, touching the keys softly. "Mr. Wilson," she said, "I lost my mom 2 years ago. Cancer." She paused. Everyone said time would make it better. They were wrong. It wasn't time that helped. It was music. Thomas looked up from his desk. Sarah had never talked about her mother before. "That's why I joined the choir," she continued. "When I sing, I feel closer to her. Maybe your proposal song could become something else, something stronger." That night, Thomas sat at his piano at home. His mother was having one of her bad days, not recognizing where she was. The home health aide had left for the evening, and the house felt empty. He opened the sheet music for the proposal piece. The notes that once spoke of love and promise now seemed naive. His fingers touched the keys, playing the melody, but differently this time. Slower, minor key. The song of heartbreak began to transform. Mrs. Harrison brought dinner, like she had every night that week. She found him at the piano. "The church council met today," she said, setting down a casserole. "We've organized a schedule. Different families will help with Margaret each day. You're not alone, Thomas." "I should have seen it coming," he said, still playing. "All the signs were there. Sometimes love makes us blind, but God sees clearly." She touched his shoulder. "Sarah's mother was my best friend, you know. Before she died, she made me promise to watch over her daughter. Now I'm promising to watch over you and Margaret." The next Sunday, Thomas returned to church for the first time since Christmas Eve. People didn't whisper this time. Instead, they hugged him, shook his hand, asked about his mother. After service, the youth pastor approached. "The teens want to know if you'll help with the youth choir. Sarah's idea. She says they need someone who understands loss." Thomas started to decline, but then he saw Sarah sitting with other teenagers, all watching hopefully. He nodded. That evening, his mother had a moment of clarity. She sat in her chair, looking out at the snow. "Play it for me," she said. "The song you wrote, the one she didn't deserve to hear." Thomas went to the piano. As he played the transformed version, his mother closed her eyes. "Much better," she said when he finished. "Now it's honest. Now it's real." The next day at school, Sarah and a few other students asked to learn the new version. "It's not a love song anymore," Thomas warned. "No," Sarah agreed. "It's a survival song. Those are more important." Weeks passed. The song evolved. Students added their own parts, their own pain, their own hope. What had started as a proposal piece became something else, a testament to surviving heartbreak. 1 month after Christmas Eve, Thomas received a letter from Rebecca. He recognized her handwriting on the envelope. Mrs. Harrison was there when it arrived. "You don't have to open it," she said. Thomas looked at the envelope, then at the piano where his transformed song sat, then at his mother sleeping peacefully in her chair. He put the unopened letter in a drawer. "Some words," he said, "don't deserve to be heard." Instead, he sat at the piano and began to play. The new melody filled the house, no longer a song of romantic love, but of something deeper. Family, community, survival. Outside, winter continued its slow march towards spring. Inside, surrounded by his true family, Thomas finally began to heal. His mother woke up and smiled, one of her clear moments returning. "That's what real love sounds like," she said. "Not the kind that leaves, but the kind that stays." Spring 2007 brought more than just melting snow. The medical bills kept coming, piling up on Thomas's kitchen table. The cost of his mother's care had doubled, and the insurance company was fighting coverage for her new medications. "I can't accept this," Thomas said, trying to return the envelope Mrs. Harrison had given him after church. "It's not charity," she insisted. "The congregation wants to help. We've all seen how much you do for the school, for the kids." The envelope contained $3,000, proceeds from a bake sale and silent auction the church had organized. Thomas knew he should accept it. The mortgage was already 2 months behind. Sarah stopped by that afternoon for her usual Sunday visit. She found Thomas at the kitchen table, surrounded by bills. "The choir wants to do a benefit concert," she announced, "for Mrs. Wilson's medical fund." Thomas looked up from the papers. "Sarah." "Just hear me out," she interrupted. "That song you wrote, the new version. People need to hear it, and we need to help you keep your house." Word had gotten out that the bank was threatening foreclosure. In a small town like Burlington, news traveled fast. The benefit concert took shape quickly. Sarah and the other students printed flyers. Church members sold tickets. The local newspaper ran a story about Thomas's dedication to his mother and his students. The night of the concert, Burlington High's auditorium was packed. Thomas stood backstage watching his students prepare. The song that had once been meant for Rebecca had evolved into something different. They called it December Snow now. His mother sat in the front row, Mrs. Harrison beside her. It was a good day. She recognized everyone and smiled at the familiar faces. When the music started, something changed in the auditorium. The students weren't just performing, they were telling a story of loss, love, and survival. Sarah's solo brought tears to several eyes. After the concert, the school principal approached Thomas. "The state music competition is coming up," she said. "Enter the choir. They're ready." The entry fee was steep, but before Thomas could decline, parents were already pulling out checkbooks. That night, checking his mother into bed, she grabbed his hand. "I heard you got a letter from Rebecca," she said clearly. "Did you read it?" "No," Thomas replied. "Some chapters need to stay closed." "Good boy." She squeezed his hand. "Now tell me about this competition." The next months brought intense preparation. The choir practiced daily. December Snow evolved further, incorporating more voices, more instruments. The students added their own stories of loss and hope to the melody. In June 2008, they took first place at the state competition. The prize money helped with 3 months of medical bills. But success brought unexpected attention. A local radio station wanted to record December Snow. A record company asked about rights. Then came the letter from Rebecca's lawyer. She'd heard about the song's success. The letter suggested she deserved partial credit, since the original composition was meant for her. Mrs. Harrison found Thomas at the church piano, reading the letter. "Don't let her steal this too," she said firmly. "This song isn't about her anymore. It's about survival." Thomas wrote a single response. "The song you rejected doesn't exist anymore. This one isn't yours to claim." That evening, his mother had another moment of clarity. "Play my song," she requested. As Thomas played December Snow, she smiled. "Much better than a proposal song," she said. "This one tells the truth." Sarah called later with news. They'd been invited to perform at the regional choir festival. The exposure could mean more opportunities, more ways to help with the mounting bills. "We'll find a way," Thomas told his mother that night. "God hasn't brought us this far to leave us now." She nodded, drifting off to sleep. Outside, summer stars shone bright, so different from the snow that had fallen that Christmas Eve. But the lesson remained the same. Sometimes the greatest gifts come from the deepest losses. Summer 2012 brought changes Thomas wasn't ready for. His mother's condition deteriorated rapidly. The doctor said it was time to prepare. Sarah, now in her senior year, visited daily. She'd sit with Margaret, singing softly while Thomas dealt with hospice arrangements. One Tuesday in August, Mrs. Harrison arrived looking troubled. "Rebecca came to see me," she said after Margaret had fallen asleep. "She wants to talk to you." Thomas continued sorting his mother's medications. "What did she want?" "She heard about Margaret, said she wants to make amends." Mrs. Harrison paused. "She's divorced now. Charles left her for someone else." "Karma," Sarah muttered from her spot near Margaret's bed. That evening, Margaret woke up fully lucid. These moments had become rare treasures. "Someone from the record company called again," Thomas told her, adjusting her pillows. "About December Snow?" Her voice was weak but clear. "How much did they offer?" "$1 million for the rights. They want to use it in a Christmas movie." Margaret shook her head. "Some things aren't for sale. That song belongs to the people who helped us survive." A week later, Rebecca sent flowers to the house. Thomas put them in the church donation basket without reading the card. "She's staying at her parents' house," Mrs. Harrison mentioned. "Says she won't leave until she talks to you." "Mom's dying," Thomas replied. "That's all I can focus on right now." Margaret passed away quietly on a Sunday morning. Thomas and Sarah were singing December Snow softly by her bed. Mrs. Harrison held her hand. The funeral brought the entire town to the church. Sarah organized the choir to perform. As they sang December Snow, now arranged as a hymn, Thomas noticed Rebecca sitting in the back pew. After the service, she approached him. "Thomas, I don't." His voice was firm. "Today isn't about you." The choir kids formed a protective circle around him. Sarah stepped forward. "You should leave, now." That night, alone in his house for the first time in years, Thomas sat at the piano. The keys felt different under his fingers. He played December Snow, letting the melody tell the story of the past 6 years. The pain, the community's love, his mother's strength. The phone rang. The record company again, doubling their offer. $2 million for full rights. Thomas thought about the medical bills, the mortgage, the years of struggling. Then he remembered his mother's words. "Some things aren't for sale." He called Sarah instead. Ready to work on that new arrangement? The next Sunday, the choir premiered the final version of December Snow at church. The melody had evolved into something profound, a story of loss, love, and redemption. Rebecca attended the service. She waited until everyone left before approaching Thomas. "I was wrong," she said, "about everything. When Charles left me, I finally understood what I'd done to you." Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since that Christmas Eve. She'd aged, but not well. Bitterness had left its mark. "Mom forgave you," he said finally. "Before she died, she said everyone deserves a second chance." He paused. "But some chances have to be earned, not given." Sarah appeared at his side. "We need to practice, Mr. Wilson." The Kennedy Center called again. Rebecca's eyes widened. "The Kennedy Center?" "December Snow is being considered for their Christmas program," Sarah explained, not bothering to hide her pride. "Turns out Mr. Wilson didn't need LA to be successful." That evening, Thomas placed his mother's photo next to the piano. "You were right, Mom," he said softly. "Some things aren't for sale, and some gifts come at exactly the right time." Outside, summer was fading into fall. Inside, the melody of December Snow filled the empty spaces, carrying with it the memory of a love that never left and the promise of winters yet to come. The Kennedy Center performance in 2015 changed everything. December Snow wasn't just a local sensation anymore. It had gone national. Thomas stood backstage, watching his students prepare for their biggest performance yet. Sarah, now teaching music at a nearby school, stood beside him. "Can you believe this is happening?" Media crews crowded the hallways. The story had caught fire. Small-town music teacher turns heartbreak into triumph. Reporters wanted interviews about Rebecca, about his mother, about the night everything changed. "Mr. Wilson," a voice called out. A man in an expensive suit approached. "I'm David Porter from Charles Thompson's legal team." Thomas tensed. He hadn't heard that name in years. "Charles wants to buy the rights to December Snow. He's prepared to offer $5 million. Sarah grabbed Thomas's arm. "Charles? Rebecca's Charles?" The lawyer nodded. "Mr. Thompson owns one of the largest media companies on the West Coast now. He sees great potential in your song." Before Thomas could respond, his phone buzzed. Mrs. Harrison's message was brief. "Charles Thompson filed for bankruptcy. It's all over the news." The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. "The offer still stands." Thomas looked at his students, their faces bright with excitement for their performance. "Tell Charles the song isn't for sale. At any price." The performance that night moved the audience to tears. The Washington Post called it a Christmas miracle in musical form. Record deals and tour offers poured in, but the attention brought problems. Reporters dug into the past. Someone found Rebecca. "Charles Thompson's ex-wife reveals true story behind Christmas sensation," the headlines read. Rebecca had sold her story to a magazine. Mrs. Harrison called immediately. "Don't read it, Thomas. It's garbage." But the damage was done. His students had seen it. Parents called, concerned about the publicity. Sarah stormed into his classroom, magazine in hand. "She's trying to take credit for your success. Says the song wouldn't exist without her." Thomas took the magazine and dropped it in the trash. "She's right. Without her, there would be no December Snow, just a forgotten proposal song that never got played." The media frenzy grew. Talk shows wanted interviews. Book publishers called. Everyone wanted the story behind the song. Then came the threatening letter from Charles's lawyers. They claimed part ownership of the song, arguing it was conceived during his relationship with Rebecca. The school board called an emergency meeting. This attention could hurt the school, they warned. But Thomas's students had other plans. They organized a press conference on the school steps. "December Snow isn't about Rebecca or Charles," Sarah announced to the cameras. "It's about community, about surviving loss, about choosing love over bitterness." The other students shared stories of how the song had helped them through their own struggles. Parents spoke about its impact on their families. That evening, Mrs. Harrison brought news. Charles's company is finished. Federal investigators found massive fraud. He's facing charges. Thomas sat at his mother's old piano. "Mom always said everything happens for a reason." The phone rang again. The Kennedy Center. They wanted December Snow to be the centerpiece of their annual Christmas program. "On one condition," Thomas told them. "My students perform it, not professional singers. These kids earned this." That Christmas, Thomas and his choir returned to Washington. As they performed, he noticed familiar faces in the audience. Church members, school families, the entire community that had supported him. Sarah conducted the finale while Thomas played. The melody filled the historic hall, not just a song anymore, but a testament to the power of community and faith. After the performance, a reporter asked Thomas about Rebecca's claims. "December Snow isn't my song," he replied. "It belongs to everyone who helped create it. My students, my community, my mother. Some things are worth more than money or fame." Back home, Mrs. Harrison hugged him. Margaret would be so proud. Thomas smiled, remembering his mother's words. Some things aren't for sale. The song had proved her right. The White House invitation arrived in early 2020. They wanted December Snow performed at the National Christmas Tree Lighting Ceremony. Thomas read the letter to his students, their faces beaming with pride. Sarah burst into his classroom later that day. CNN just announced it. We're trending on social media. But the excitement was interrupted by Mrs. Harrison's call. "Thomas, I need you to come over. My doctor just called." He found her sitting in her kitchen, medical papers spread across the table. The diagnosis was clear: advanced cancer. The same type that had taken Sarah's mother. "I don't want Sarah to know yet," Mrs. Harrison said. "She's already lost one mother figure." Thomas sat with her through the afternoon, memories of his own mother's illness flooding back. "I'll help you through this," he promised. "Like you helped us." The next day brought more demands for December Snow. A national tour, a record deal, a Christmas special. "Think about it," his agent urged. "You could reach millions, make real money." But Thomas looked at his students, at Sarah teaching the younger kids, at Mrs. Harrison sitting in the back of the choir room during practice, getting weaker each day. "My place is here," he told the agent. "These people are my family." News of Charles's arrest made national headlines. Federal agents had uncovered years of investment fraud. His victims included Rebecca's parents, who'd lost their retirement savings. Rebecca tried calling again. Thomas let it go to voicemail. "She's back in town," Sarah reported, working as a bank teller. Her parents had to sell their house. Thomas focused instead on Mrs. Harrison's treatment. Between teaching and choir practice, he drove her to chemotherapy, graded papers in hospital waiting rooms, arranged meals from church members. The White House called again. They needed an answer about the Christmas performance. "Take it," Mrs. Harrison insisted from her treatment chair. "Margaret would want you to." That evening, Thomas gathered his students. "We've been invited to perform at the White House, but Mrs. Harrison needs us too. The choice is yours." Without hesitation, they chose to stay. The choir organized a schedule, half practicing with Sarah, half helping with Mrs. Harrison's care. December Snow became their anthem of hope again. They sang it in the hospital corridors, in Mrs. Harrison's living room, at prayer meetings. The media criticized Thomas for turning down the White House. "Small-town teacher refuses national spotlight," the headlines read. But Thomas remembered his mother's words about things that weren't for sale. Success meant nothing without family. Sarah found him in the choir room one evening. "Mom died during Christmas season," she said quietly. "That's why your song means so much. It's about choosing love over everything else." The school board called a meeting. Declining the White House had brought negative attention. Some wanted Thomas to reconsider. "This program isn't about fame," he told them. "It's about community, about being there for each other." Mrs. Harrison's condition worsened as winter approached. During one of her stronger days, she made Thomas promise something. "When I'm gone," she said, "play December Snow at my funeral, just like you did for Margaret." "You're not going anywhere," Thomas insisted. She smiled weakly. "Everyone goes somewhere, Thomas. What matters is the love we leave behind." That night, Thomas sat at his piano, thinking about choices and consequences. The White House performance would have meant national recognition. But sitting with Mrs. Harrison through chemotherapy meant something more. It meant being family. His phone buzzed. Another headline about Charles's conviction. 15 years in federal prison. Thomas thought about that Christmas Eve so long ago when he thought his world had ended. How wrong he'd been. "Some gifts," his mother used to say, "take time to understand." Now, watching his students care for Mrs. Harrison, seeing Sarah become the teacher he'd always known she could be, he finally understood what his mother meant. Success wasn't about national tours or White House performances. It was about being there for the people who'd been there for you. That was the real gift of December snow. Christmas Eve 2024 arrived with heavy snow, just like that night 18 years ago. Thomas helped Mrs. Harrison into her wheelchair for the trip to Burlington Square Mall. Her cancer was in remission, but she'd never fully regained her strength. "Are you sure you're up for this?" Thomas asked, adjusting her blanket. "I wouldn't miss it for the world," she replied. 18 years, Thomas. It's time." The mall had changed over the years, but the massive Christmas tree still stood in the center court. Thomas's students were setting up their equipment in the same spot where he'd once planned to propose. Sarah organized the choir, now including some of her own students. "Ready for December snow, Mr. Wilson?" Thomas nodded, trying to ignore the memories flooding back. Then he saw her. Near Santa's workshop, wearing an elf costume complete with pointed hat and jingle bells, stood Rebecca. She was handing out candy canes to children waiting in line, her movements mechanical, her face lined with years of hardship. The candy basket slipped from her hands. Candy canes scattered across the floor, the sound of her jingle bell hat accompanying her shaky movements as she tried to collect them. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, recognizing her immediately. "Is that—" Mrs. Harrison gripped Thomas's hand. "Remember what Margaret always said about God's timing." Rebecca hadn't noticed them yet. She continued her work, straightening her green elf dress, adjusting the striped socks that were part of her costume. The woman who once mocked Thomas's small-town life now worked minimum wage as a mall elf. "Should we cancel?" Sarah asked. Thomas shook his head. Mom was right. Some gifts take time to understand. The choir assembled. Local news cameras set up. The performance had become a town tradition. Rebecca finally looked up as the first notes of December snow filled the mall. Their eyes met. She froze, one hand clutching her candy basket, the other touching her jingle bell hat. The teenager working as Santa stopped his ho-ho-ho to watch her reaction. Thomas conducted the choir, his back straight, his movements confident. He wasn't the heartbroken man from 18 years ago. His hair had grayed, but his eyes showed peace instead of pain. Rebecca's hands trembled as she watched. Gone was the polished executive who'd once dreamed of LA success. The years had worn her down, each line in her face telling stories of hard lessons learned. The music swelled. Shoppers stopped to listen, many wiping tears. They all knew the story behind the song. It had become part of Burlington's history. Mrs. Harrison watched Rebecca from her wheelchair. "Poor thing," she whispered to Sarah. "She chose the wrong kind of success." As the final notes faded, Rebecca tried to slip away, but her jingle bell hat betrayed her movement. Sarah stepped forward, blocking her path. "He wrote this after you left. When everyone else thought he was finished, he turned pain into something beautiful." Rebecca's voice shook. "I know. I've heard it on the radio, every Christmas." She stopped, struggling to continue. "I work here now. After Charles went to prison, after my parents lost everything, this was all I could get." Thomas approached slowly, Mrs. Harrison beside him in her wheelchair. "Thomas," Rebecca started, but he raised his hand. "Some gifts," he said quietly, "come exactly when we need them. Tonight I got mine, knowing Mom was right. Everything does happen for a reason." The choir began packing up. Families drifted back to their shopping. But something had shifted in the air, like the first snow of winter changing the landscape. Rebecca stood alone by Santa's workshop, her elf costume a stark reminder of how far she'd fallen. The same spot where she'd once crushed Thomas's dreams had become the scene of his ultimate vindication. As Thomas wheeled Mrs. Harrison toward the exit, the choir softly hummed December Snow. The melody echoed through the mall, carrying 18 years of history in its notes. Sometimes the best gifts aren't the ones we plan for, but the ones that find us when we're ready to receive them. The day after the mall performance, Sarah brought Thomas the local newspaper. His choir made the front page, but the story focused on Rebecca, the former executive turned mall elf, watching her ex-fiancé's triumph. "She's still here," Sarah said. "Working the morning shift, people are talking." Thomas set the paper aside. Let them talk. But the story emerged piece by piece. Rebecca's father visited the school, asking to speak with Thomas. He looked older, worn down by years of hardship. "I need you to know what happened," he said, sitting heavily in a classroom chair. "After she left with Charles, everything changed. The money, the success, it was all fake. Charles had built his empire on fraud, convincing investors, including Rebecca's parents, to trust him with their savings. When federal investigators uncovered the scheme, everything collapsed. Rebecca didn't know at first. Her father continued. By the time she figured it out, it was too late. Charles had moved all our money offshore. Then he left her for his lawyer." The story spread through Burlington. Rebecca, who'd once mocked small-town life, now lived in a tiny apartment above the drugstore. She worked 3 jobs: mall elf during Christmas, bank teller in the afternoons, waitress at night. Mrs. Harrison, still recovering from her cancer treatments, insisted on hearing the whole story. "She's caring for her father now," she told Thomas. "He has Alzheimer's, just like Margaret." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Rebecca spent her evenings in the same care facility where Thomas had taken his mother, attending the same support groups, facing the same struggles. Sarah confronted Rebecca one morning at the mall. "You broke his heart," in front of everyone. Rebecca didn't defend herself. "I was stupid, greedy. I thought Charles meant success." She straightened her elf hat. "Now I understand what real success looks like. It's what Thomas has: respect, purpose, love." That afternoon, Thomas found a letter in his school mailbox. Rebecca's familiar handwriting had changed, become shakier. "I watch you with your students," she wrote. "You're the same person you always were. Kind, dedicated, real. I became someone else with Charles. Someone horrible. When he left me, I had to find myself again. Taking care of Dad. It's teaching me what you knew all along. Love isn't about success. It's about showing up every day." The local news ran a story about Charles in prison. 15 years for fraud. His lawyer girlfriend had turned state's evidence against him. "Karma," Sarah said, reading the article. But Thomas remembered his mother's words about forgiveness, about second chances. That evening, he visited the care facility where Rebecca's father lived. He found her in the common room, helping her father eat dinner. "I'm sorry," she said when she saw him, "not just for Christmas Eve, for not understanding what really mattered." Her father looked up, confused. "Is it time for my medicine?" "Not yet, Dad." Rebecca's voice carried the same patience Thomas had used with his mother. "Soon." Thomas watched them. The woman who'd once criticized him for wasting his life caring for his mother now lived the same reality. "Life has a way of teaching us what we need to learn," he said quietly. Rebecca nodded, wiping her father's chin. "I hear December snow everywhere. Every store, every radio station. It's beautiful." She paused. "It's what real love sounds like." Outside the care facility, Mrs. Harrison waited in her car. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked. Thomas thought about Rebecca, about his mother, about the twists and turns that brought them all here. "Mom used to say everything happens for a reason," he replied. "I think I finally understand why." The snow began to fall, soft and gentle, like forgiveness. 2 days before Christmas, Thomas found Rebecca waiting outside his classroom. Her elf shift had ended, but she still wore the costume, no time to change before her next job. "Can we talk?" she asked. "Really talk?" Sarah, grading papers at her desk, stood up protectively. Thomas nodded at her. "It's okay, Sarah." They walked to the auditorium where the choir had been practicing for the Christmas Eve service. Rebecca sat in the front row, her jingle bell hat in her hands. "I keep thinking about your mom," she said, "how you took care of her. Now, with Dad." She stopped, collecting herself. "The doctors say he has 2 years, maybe less, just like Margaret." Thomas sat at the piano, his fingers finding the opening notes of December snow. "I hear it every night at the restaurant," Rebecca continued. "People request it. They don't know I'm the one who—" She twisted the hat in her hands, "the one who threw it away." Mrs. Harrison's wheelchair squeaked as she entered the auditorium. "I thought I'd find you both here." Rebecca stood quickly. "Mrs. Harrison, I heard about your cancer. I'm so sorry." "Sit down, dear." Mrs. Harrison wheeled closer. "Thomas, play it for us, the original version." His hands moved across the keys, playing the proposal song as it had been meant to sound that Christmas Eve. Simple, hopeful, innocent. "Now play what it became," Mrs. Harrison instructed. December snow filled the auditorium, complex, deep, carrying 18 years of life's lessons in its melody. "That's what forgiveness sounds like," Mrs. Harrison said. "The journey from what was to what is." Rebecca wiped her eyes. "I don't deserve forgiveness." "None of us do," Mrs. Harrison replied. "That's what makes it a gift." Sarah appeared in the doorway, listening. She'd lost her mother in the same journey of December snow. "Your dad," Thomas said finally. "How are you managing the care costs?" "I'm not," Rebecca admitted. 3 jobs barely cover the facility. I'm losing my apartment next month." Mrs. Harrison reached for Thomas's hand. "Margaret always said everything happens for a reason." Thomas nodded, understanding. "The church runs a care support group for families dealing with Alzheimer's Tuesday nights." "I know," Rebecca said. "I've walked by but never had the courage to go in." "I'll be there," Thomas said. "I still help lead it. Your dad, he could come to the daycare program at the school too, where Mom used to go." Sarah stepped forward. "We help families who can't afford care. The choir does fundraisers." Rebecca's hands shook. "Why would you help me? After what I did?" "Because 18 years ago, this community helped me survive," Thomas answered. "They showed me what real love looks like." Mrs. Harrison smiled. "Margaret used to say there are no coincidences. Your father getting sick, you coming back here, Thomas still leading that support group." "The same support group that helped him through Margaret's illness," Sarah added. Rebecca stood, straightening her elf costume. "I have to get to the bank. My shift starts in 20 minutes. "Tuesday night," Thomas reminded her. 7 o'clock. As Rebecca left, her jingle bells fading down the hallway, Mrs. Harrison turned to Thomas. "You've made Margaret proud," she said. "This is what she meant about gifts coming when we need them." That evening, Thomas played December Snow at home, thinking about cycles of care and forgiveness. His phone buzzed, a text from Rebecca. "Dad asked about the choir today. A clear moment. He remembers music." Thomas remembered how his mother lit up at music, even in her final days. He texted back, "Bring him to practice tomorrow." Sarah called later. "Are you sure about this?" "Mom always said everyone deserves a second chance," he replied. She was right about everything else. The snow fell outside, covering Burlington in white. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more care decisions, more moments of grace. But tonight, December Snow played on, its melody carrying the weight of forgiveness, the promise of redemption, and the truth about love's many forms. Christmas Eve arrived again at Burlington Square Mall. Thomas stood before his expanded choir, current students, alumni, and community members who'd been part of December Snow's journey over the past 18 years. Sarah conducted the warm-up, while Thomas checked on Mrs. Harrison, now strong enough to sit without her wheelchair. In the front row, Rebecca sat with her father, who was having a remarkably clear day. "Is it time for the song?" he asked Rebecca. "The snow song?" "Soon, Dad," she answered, adjusting his sweater. She'd switched shifts at the bank to bring him, still wearing her elf costume from the morning shift. The mall had changed since that first Christmas Eve, but the massive tree still stood in the same spot. Thomas looked at the gathering crowd, familiar faces from 18 years of community support, new families drawn by the song's reputation, local media setting up cameras. "Ready?" Sarah asked, stepping onto the conductor's platform. Thomas nodded, taking his place at the piano. His hands found the keys just as they had that first night, but everything else had changed. The music began softly. Rebecca's father sat up straighter, recognition flickering in his eyes. "I know this song," he whispered. As December Snow filled the mall, Thomas watched the faces in the crowd. Mrs. Harrison wiping tears, remembering Margaret. Sarah conducting with the confidence of someone who'd found her calling. His students, past and present, singing the song that had helped so many through their own storms. Rebecca sat quietly, holding her father's hand. The journey from that first Christmas Eve to this moment hadn't been easy for anyone. But the song had grown with them, carrying their stories of loss, love, and redemption. "Remember when you played this for your mother?" Mrs. Harrison asked during the instrumental break. "How she said some things aren't for sale?" Thomas nodded, his fingers moving across the keys. Margaret had been right about everything, about love, about forgiveness, about God's timing. The song swelled to its finale. Rebecca's father stood suddenly, his voice clear and strong, joining the final chorus. Rebecca supported him, tears streaming down her face, her elf hat forgotten in her lap. As the last notes faded, the crowd erupted in applause. But Thomas wasn't watching them. He watched Rebecca's father hug her, fully present in this moment, both of them transformed by the same journey Thomas had walked with Margaret. "Play it again," Sarah suggested. "The original version, the one that started everything." Thomas began the simpler melody, the proposal song that never got played. But this time, it wasn't about lost love or betrayal. It was about the gift of that Christmas Eve 18 years ago, the gift that had brought them all here. "I understand now," Rebecca said quietly to Mrs. Harrison. What Thomas had back then, that was real success. Mrs. Harrison squeezed her hand. "It's not too late to build something real." The snow began falling outside the mall windows, just like that night 18 years ago. But this time, it felt like a blessing instead of an ending. Thomas played the final chord, letting it fade into silence. His mother's picture sat on the piano, next to the sheet music she'd never let him sell. Sarah stepped forward. "Mr. Wilson started this song as a proposal. Life turned it into something else, a gift we all needed." The choir gathered around the piano. Students who'd grown up with December snow, parents who'd supported them, community members who'd helped along the way. "Every Christmas Eve," Thomas said, standing to face the crowd, "my mother would say everything happens for a reason. Tonight, looking at all of you, I know she was right." Rebecca helped her father stand. In his clear moment, he smiled at Thomas. "Beautiful song," he said. "Sounds like love." As the crowd dispersed, Thomas remained at the piano. The mall would close soon, but this moment, this gift, would stay with them all. Sometimes the best presents aren't the ones we wish for, but the ones God knows we need. Sometimes it takes 18 years to understand why a heart had to break before it could truly heal. December snow played on, carrying their stories forward, a reminder that love, real love, never really ends. It just changes into something better. If you enjoyed this heartwarming story of love, forgiveness, and redemption, please hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Thomas's situation? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more touching stories that remind us of life's most precious gifts. Remember, just like December snow taught us, sometimes the most beautiful melodies come from our deepest heartbreaks.